Welcome to the Historical Movies Podcast, a podcast all about movies inspired by history. I'm Ross Evans, I'm an editor, and I'm joined by Professor of Modern History at Liverpool Hope University and historical scriptwriter, Bryce Evans. Bryce, how are you doing?
Very good. Ahoy there, shipmates.
Ahoy. I hear you're a bit under the weather. A bit of touch of scurvy.
A bit of the old scurvy. Yes, I've been eating my limes.
And in this episode, I don't need a flag, Mr. Christian. Unlike you, I still have a country. It's Mutiny on the Bounty. So, Bryce, Mutiny on the Bounty. The last episode was Titanic, so we're sticking with the nautical theme, and we're also sticking with the eye-watering budget theme, because when this was made in 1962, it cost $19 million, which is roughly the equivalent of about $200 million in today's money, making it, for a short while before Cleopatra came out, the most expensive film in the world. It was a tremendous box office flop. It only made $13.6 million at the box office. But I had a great time with it. As I said during our Zulu podcast, I'm a big fan of 60s movies. And this is very loudly a 60s movie. In fact, it opens with an overture, a musical piece, and a full credit sequence. And I sat down with a beer and pizza to watch this. And by the time the overture and credits were done and the actual film started, I'd almost finished my dinner. Yes, it's set in 1789. And we open on Portsmouth Dock and we hear the botanist, William Brown, in voiceover saying that the Bounty is off to Tahiti to pick up breadfruit to take to Jamaica to feed the poor. And then we get the bombshell that is Marlon Brando in this movie. His entrance wearing a lavish grey Pilgrim Fathers outfit with a shocking red cape on the dockside. And then we're off on a naval adventure. And what a ripping naval adventure this is, Bryce. And I had a great time, certainly in those parts, because as you know, I'm a big fan of submarine movies, naval movies, and space movies. Anything when there's a sort of existential threat outside, and people have got to come together and survive against the odds on a boat or a ship or something like that. So, how did you find Mutiny on the Bounty?
I really like this movie, even though I think it has a huge amount of flaws, as reflected in the chaotic filming and grossly inflated budget and then box office flop. But it's packed to the gunwales, to use a nautical term, with brooding Brando. And I'm a very big fan of Marlon Brando. The New Yorker described his performance as Fletcher Christian, that he played it like a seagoing Hamlet, and for that reason alone, I'm a really, really big fan of this movie. It's the second big blockbuster rendering of this great episode in history. The first 1935, then it was Clark Gable playing Fletcher Christian, and after this, of course, we had the 1984 version in which friend of the pod, Mel Gibson, plays Fletcher Christian. But for my money, and I think due to the chaos of the stories of the filming, and because of Marlon, this is my favourite version.
Yeah, it's a great excess from Marlon Brando, which kind of matches the... There's this kind of native allure of the cornucopian tropical island in this movie with native girls, topless. Coconuts are plenty and they'll just fall out and you can just crack them open and eat them. And a land of plenty somewhere in Polynesia.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like Paul Gauguin, the French artist, of course, later on was seduced by Tahiti, and who wouldn't be? I mean, when the order comes to get back on the ship to go back to, grey old Blighty, can you blame them for wanting to stay in paradise?
Yeah, and this movie also is, if you look at the tags on Amazon Movies, as I was for this movie, downbeat and harrowing, which are not two tags I think most blockbusters are associated with, certainly not these days. But this is a tragic movie in the end, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the fact that this is a tragedy in many ways, the inescapable cruelty of man, and many other themes that make it a tragedy. Yes, so we touch on the history, the real history. I've written down that the Bounty left England in 1787 on a mission to bring breadfruit from Tahiti to the West Indies. It actually, in the movie, they say, the botanist says that they first want to feed the slaves and then the rest of the world. They make up that they're on this sort of life-saving mission for all of mankind. He says it's a blessing for the poor. But actually, as I understand the history, it was actually just cheap food for West Indian slave plantations after the supply of food from the Americas after the American Revolutionary War ended.
Yeah, there's nothing, this is typical, isn't it, of movies of exploration, the sort of universalist, civilizational, progressive, upbeat justification. But of course, it's cheap food for the slaves and for that horrid system that is there. So that's, I suppose, an inaccuracy. While we're at it, I suppose a lot of it comes, a lot of the theme and the dynamic of Mutiny on the Bounty, the story, the movies, comes down to Bligh. And Bligh is probably portrayed here as more cruel than he was perhaps in real life. He makes the men climb the yardarm for a spoonful of water. There are sort of various other incidents where they kind of lay it on a little bit thick. I don't think the movie can quite... I think if you read about the making of this movie and the problems with the script, they couldn't quite make up their minds whether they were going to actually portray Bligh as a more sympathetic character or not. And that's part of the issue here.
Yeah, I get the Bligh character is just almost sadistic, and there's no kind of evolution of his character. And I read in the history that Bligh and Christian actually got on quite well, and it took quite a long time for that relationship to sour. Bligh made Christian the second in command, and then they stayed in Tahiti for 5 months.
Yeah.
Had a great time, by all accounts.
Oh, yeah.
Then set off for the West Indies, and then on the 28th of April, 1789, there was a mutiny in the Pacific Ocean.
I think Bligh was perhaps less of a sort of bastard than is depicted here. For example, he never keelhauled his men. It's that scene where one of the crew is keelhauled, to be thrown over with a rope, dragged through the sea. Apparently, Bligh never did that. Another point, I suppose, not to be too pedantic, but Bligh, of course, would have been, much younger. Would have been in his 30s. He's portrayed here by Trevor Howard, later Anthony Hopkins in the 80s version, is sort of well into the 50s, like the older man to the sort of younger Fletcher Christian. Again, not true. Another thing as well, which is problematic about the sort of the posterity and the romance of this story, is that Fletcher Christian was actually from a much wealthier background than Bligh. So that sort of notion of the kind of the lower orders rising up against the tyrannical higher orders, because of course this is at the time of the French Revolution. Well, Fletcher Christian was actually from quite a wealthy background, went to school with William Wordsworth, was descended from sort of Manx nobility. Would have actually... He probably, to be fair to Marlon Brando, who took a lot of stick for his exaggerated sort of Hamlet-esque accent and demeanour, he probably would have spoken a little bit like that, because he certainly wasn't... he wasn't... This isn't really a simplistic story of the lower orders throwing off the shackles of tyranny, in one sense. In another sense, of course, it is, but I suppose we'll get to that later on.
Yeah, I think, obviously Brando's turned it up to 11 with playing the upper class fop, though, isn't he? It really is unbelievable, some of the clothes he wears. He's wearing a tartan scarf, I think, at some point in this movie. It's bizarre. Yeah. I've got a quote here from Samuel Johnson, the 18th century, what made the dictionary. A ship is worse than jail. Being in a ship is being in jail with the chance of being drowned. As a description to how tough life and miserable life was in the 18th century Royal Navy, with cramped accommodation, terrible diet, the risk of being blown to smithereens, or succumbing to scurvy, or dying of taking a long time to die of some kind of disease or injury.
Yeah.
No fun at all. Not seen so clearly in this movie. But would you blame, historically, talking of mutinies, would you blame the mutineers?
Absolutely not. I've just said how, I suppose I'm going to contradict myself here, that it's not a simplistic story of liberty versus tyranny. But on the other hand, it is, because, although I've just sort of defended Bligh there, I think even by the standards of the time, Bligh was a bit of a tyrant. And although he was sort of exonerated later on, they also found that he shouldn't have been in command of that ship. The British Crown and Empire at this time are, in my historical judgment, pretty tyrannical as well. And I know that might sound a bit flippant or simplistic, but to answer your question, I say good for the mutineers and huzzah for liberty.
Yes, this is at the time, as you said, of the French Revolution. Can you give us a bit of background on that? This is a period in European history when there's a lot of revolutionary action going on, a lot of revolutionary thinking all across Europe.
Yeah, and
indeed the world.
Yeah, and you've got the serious sort of outbreaks of disorder within the British fleet, the mutiny at Spithead and that kind of thing. You've got the feeling of liberty, the notion of throwing off the shackles of the, like we were saying with the Titanic last week, the sort of the horribly unjust and class-bound old order of aristocracy. Now, this, like I've said, it's a bit too simplistic to render this like that, but I don't think, given the time that it's made, 1787, 1790, everything that's going on in Europe and the world, and the revolution there, I think, the notion, I'm still a little bit in love with this story, in the sense of I'm totally it's really hard to not be on the side of the mutineers. Now, we'll get to what happens later on with their descendants on Pitcairn Island when things turn a little bit darker. But, I think this movie is about liberty and about its extremes, I suppose, and a notion of anti-tyranny. Now, and that's actually my big problem with this movie, because if you think about the history here, their decision to mutiny in the first place, it is momentous and revolutionary, and then the decision later on to go from Tahiti to Pitcairn to sink the Bounty, it's the tough decisions of guaranteeing your liberty, but at the expense of never being able to leave Pitcairn Island. And they it's the extremes of liberty and the sort of jeopardy involved, which I think is the endearing romance of this story. And of course, in this movie, I don't think you get that, because at the end, to jump to the end of things, if I may, Marlon Brando, Fletcher Christian, is killed because of a fire on the Bounty, because he's taking the decision that he's about to return to England.
He's leaving that open at least, isn't he? Yeah,
well, yeah, it is. But I mean, that's sort of, for me, that's kind of the whole point of, if you're on the side of Christian and the mutineers, is that they took that hard but sort of dedicated decision that they'd cut themselves off from the world for the sake of liberty. This is like the sort of extreme jeopardy involved. It wasn't the notion of, we'll return. The very reason they went to Pitcairn was to escape the tyranny of empire, if you like, and justice. And it's not this idea that he was going to go back. I just think, wow, what a very sort of strange message for the film to put across, and I have to say, what a disappointing ending therefore.
Yes, I would agree with you. As I said earlier, that I like the fact that it's a tragic ending, but the point of it, I mean, it does play with the idea of them being stuck by their own freedom, or stuck in a jail of their own freedom. At one point, Brando says to Richard Harris, "You're in a prison now, Mills, with one slight difference. You're not locked in, you're locked out," or words to those effect. And as you say, the actual history of when, after the mutineers, so 18 mutineers pack Bligh, and 18 of those loyal to him in a small boat, set him afloat. And then they return to Tahiti, Christian and the mutineers. and name drop Captain Cook. When I was reading the history, they name dropped Captain Cook, who'd been dead for 10 years, to get supplies from the Tahitians, which worked. And eventually they ended up at Pitcairn Island with 9 mutineers, 6 Tahitian men and 11 Tahitian women. And they did, in fact, burn the Bounty.
Yeah.
But, of course, what happens to Christian is that there are varying accounts of his death, but he's basically killed by the Tahitian men because they were treating the Tahitians as slaves, basically, when they got to Pitcairn, which I suppose is an irony in itself, that they're not even aware of their own freedom.
Yeah. Of course, we can't get too seduced by these sort of romantic notions of this, but and you know, that is, there's differing accounts, isn't there, of how he dies, but yeah, that's probably, let's be honest, the most likely event in keeping with that sort of frontiersman mentality of the white European of the time. Probably quite accurate, but just the idea of going to Pitcairn in the first place, 9 of them and the Tahitians, you know, uninhabited, quite forbidding, uncharted.
Yeah.
To evade justice, and that's kind of ruined by the idea in this movie that actually Marlon Brando's just going to go home. He's had enough. Well, come on, what were they thinking? Anyway,
I suppose it's a good question. I mean, it is quite a pivotal question in this movie, because the ending is, I suppose, the great piece of this movie, isn't it? You know, because I mean, how do you I found the mutiny scene a little bit disappointing. And I think the ending is supposed to be the kind of thing where they're making the movie thinking, we're going to get an Oscar for this one. We'll come up with a dramatic ending. But it just doesn't quite, doesn't really fit together, does it? It doesn't make a lot of sense. There's not much coherence.
It doesn't.
And
of course, the American audiences are, maybe this is partly explains why it's such a flop. Although, we talk about sort of maybe method acting, Brando, like the real life Fletcher Christian, marries Princess Maimiti, or the actress who plays her, Teresa. He plays it with this upper class English accent. Now that immediately flags, doesn't it, for American audiences? Tyranny, baddie. But of course he's playing this, so it's very confusing in its messages here, in terms of he's playing this buttoned up, upper class English guy. You shall not put your foot on me again, sir. You know, it's very confusing, I think, for a lot of audiences as to who's sort of the goodie and who's the baddie here, and maybe that shows a certain sophistication to this. But Brando, yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by Brando on this movie, almost like Fletcher Christian and the mutineers cutting themselves off from the world, taking that conscious decision. Almost Brando did that with this movie. It sort of sinks his career, to use another maritime metaphor, for 10 years, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He marries Teresa, and he sort of, it's a lovely story in a way, in that he falls in love with the place, and he goes swimming with the locals every day, and bought an
island, didn't he, off Tahiti as well? And as I understand it, became a ham radio operator in his spare time. And he island in the Pacific.
And if you think again that metaphor of just sort of cutting yourself off from the Hollywood mainstream through this disaster of a movie, he chooses this over Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes, amazing. Yes.
Yeah. And you just think, and just sort of torpedoes. I'm going mad with the nautical analogies here. Torpedoes his own career.
Yeah,
I'm going overboard here. He torpedoes his own career for the next decade, and for that reason alone, I mean, perhaps we'll get to the some of the stories about the hijinks and overblown budget on set. Yeah, later on.
Oh yes, we will. Yeah, I just want to pick up briefly then on that. You mentioned the Spithead mutiny, which was a bit later than this, isn't it? But it was a successful quasi strike of 16 ships in the English Channel. Successful in getting better pay and living conditions. And there's another one in the same year, the Nore mutiny, which was on the Thames estuary, I think a little later, which was that was not successful, where they hanged 29 people and imprisoned a lot and transported a lot of them to Australia. So this is a period, actually, when I was researching this, I Googled Royal Navy mutinies, how common? And found it quite difficult to work out. You know, no one's come up with a definitive list of how common this was on boats in this period, because the living conditions are so horrific.
Rum sodomy in the lash.
Exactly, yeah. And as Bly says, you know, fear is the only way to to make men do things that they don't want to do, like climb the rigging and gale force winds and perhaps fall off.
Yeah, and I mean, look, you meant, in keeping with the theme of the time and that sort of Enlightenment sort of vogue of the period. I like you said there, you know, Fletcher Christian and his men, in all likelihood, treated the Tahitians abominably. There's very, you know, big limits to the notion of liberty here. Okay, I get that, but I think one of the reasons why it's an abidingly romantic story and why it's been adapted so many times, you know, 3 times by Hollywood alone, is the notion of Fletcher Christian ties into you know, the literature of a sort of romance and enlightenment of that period. Like I say, he goes to school with Wordsworth. There was rumours after his death that he'd faked his death and he'd returned to England, Fletcher Christian. And it's even said to have inspired Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, that the Ancient Mariner might be the embodiment of Fletcher Christian as a sort of, you know, barnacled old sailor coming home. And I just think there's a lot of romance to this story, which the movie fails to sort of capture in a lot of ways.
Yes. So Pitcairn Island, population 35 as of 2023, pretty much all descendants of people who came on the Bounty. The Bounty landed in Pitcairn in January 1790, and Christian was killed in September 1793. So he only lasted 3.5 years before he was killed, they think, by
and of
the
course,
Tahitians.
You know, in line with the small population there, we're of course going to mention here the quite dark postscript to all this, which was the fact that in 2004, half the adult male population of the Pitcairn Islands was found guilty of rape and incest. Were you aware of this?
Yeah, I haven't. I've seen a headline or two, but I haven't read much about it.
2004, 6 men, again all descendants, of course, of the mutineers. Like I say, half the adult male population found guilty of rape and incest. Basically, they're not living the virtuous life of paradise. They are actually quite horrific bullies and rapists. And if you look at the details of that in 2004, and if you think about the very small gene pool, this sort of romance of this story has a very, very dark postscript indeed. But maybe we won't sort of labour that.
No, I mean, if you read the history, they basically all end up killing each other or committing suicide. I think one guy died of an asthma attack. And when the Royal Navy finally returned, they kind of lost interest at reading about this, the Royal Navy. I think Bligh, it took him, you know, like a year basically to get back to London to report it. You know, the distances are so vast and the time scale is so crazy. They,
I have to say, Bligh
didn't get to Pitcairn until 1814, and there was only John Adams is the only survivor from the Bounty that was left.
But Bligh, you know, for the baddie, for the villain of the piece, what an amazing feat of navigation to actually get home. It is quite
4,000 miles or something.
I mean, and if you read about the making of this movie, they couldn't actually quite make up their mind. They at one stage wanted to make a movie about that amazing feat of survival, and that's probably part of the issue here with the script and the confusing messages, which explain perhaps its poor reception. Because there's bits, it's very disjointed in terms of the sort of messages it's trying to get across here.
Marlon Brando, Bryce, paid $500,000 for this film. That's more than $5 million in today's money. Improvised many of his lines, frequently hours late to the set. Put cotton in his ears so he couldn't hear Trevor Howard's lines. Pulled actors off set to help decorate a friend's wedding in Tahiti. Frequently left the set early. Had crates of champagne flown in for parties. And apparently, I'm not sure I believe this, split the seat of 52 pairs of trousers due to his fluctuating weight. Well,
you know, I'm a huge Brando fan. I think I was telling you before the perhaps apocryphal, but I like to believe it, story of when he's on the set, you know, in his later years of Apocalypse Now, and again paid an inordinate amount of money, like extremely bloated amount of money, and he is himself physically bloated at this stage and can't really be arsed to basically do a little cameo. He's only in the movie at the end for a few minutes, and it sort of breaks the budget, and Francis Ford Coppola says, okay, we'll meet your financial demands, but Marlon, could you please just read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which is a very short book. Heart of Darkness. I mean, it is really short. And he says, okay, if you pay me this money, I'll read it. And then when they eventually get to filming and they get him out there after all these negotiations, and he's sort of saying, right, okay, Marlon, so you know that bit in Heart of Darkness? He's like, haven't read it. and I love sulky Marlon Brando, can't be arsed. My favourite yarn about the filming of this, which is the filming of this is such a disaster that there's actually a diplomatic impact of all of this.
Right.
There's a document I was looking at online from the US consulate in Tahiti to the State Department in Washington, saying that the filming of this movie, and I quote, has aggravated and distorted the entire image of the United States of America amongst French officials and locals. It's a disaster from start to finish, and my favourite perhaps apocryphal Brando story is that when he was in a big mood, when he had a big puss on Brando, he would sulk by just standing in front of the camera and refusing to act.
It is great, isn't it?
Oh, it's wonderful.
Oh, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So maybe that's a good place to get on to our questions then, Bryce, that we ask of every film. I had a first question, which I think is an easy one. Are you Team Bly or Team Christian?
Oh, 100% Team Christian in every way possible. How about yourself?
Yeah, me too, definitely. Let's jump on straight then to favourite performance and character, because for
Brando.
me it has to be Marlon Brando. And
next question.
I think one of my... Yeah, go on, sorry.
No, go on. Next question, because it's just Brando. There is no debate about this.
I mean, there's decent Richard Harris, a great actor, refused to attend the premiere apparently because he was so pissed off. Trevor Howard.
Trevor Howard's very, very good, actually. Yeah, I like Trevor Howard in this. I think he's up there with. I mean, a lot of people say Charles Lawton in 1935 was maybe the best Bly, the most tyrannical Bly. Anthony Hopkins, of course, again another highly esteemed actor. But I actually think Trevor Howard does really quite a good job here. He's quite a believable villain, or is he a villain? Yeah.
Yes, well, he's not really given a huge amount of leeway in this movie, is he? Because he is basically just through and through a baddie. It's as simple as that. And I think that kind of it's a little simplistic, as we know from the history as well. Apparently they're getting on quite well, at least at the beginning. Yeah, it definitely seems to me that after 5 months in Tahiti, everyone realises how sailing around the world is on a little boat. And they just think, well, I've had enough of this.
And that's a curious thing, to go back to one of your early points about how it's a 60s movie. In some ways, yeah, it is. In other ways, it's not a 60s movie at all, because maybe it's the way Brando plays Fletcher Christian. It's very uptight movie for the 60s, and the theme of free love, and there's no more free love theme than the Paradise of Tahiti, with these readily available women, and then the different notions of things like polyamory, etc. And I think, it's made, obviously it's the early 60s, but, I kind of think to myself, guys, this is very, for the free love theme, which is actually even there in the 1790s, this is very sort of uptight for a 60s movie.
Yeah, it is. That's a fair point, yeah. Well, then that brings me nicely on to the favourite scene, because it's not my favourite scene, but it is one of the most ridiculous scenes I've seen in a film for a very long time. It's the point at which... Brando is standing on the prow of the launch boat when he's just been ordered to go off and shag the king's daughter, basically, and then we hear Rule Britannia as he's standing on the prow of the boat as it glides gleefully towards Tahiti. It's ridiculous.
It's hardly a hardship posting, is it, or a tough assignment? It's. I actually had that as my favourite scene. It's so. I don't think it's intentionally funny, but I laughed and laughed at that scene.
There's a lot of scenes that are not intentionally funny. There's that very odd scene when Marlon Brando gives permission to the other seamen to go and have fun with the Tahitians fishing.
Yeah,
that's a very weird scene, and also very. Yeah, as you say, uptight. Very good point. Yeah. Very sexually frustrated Marlon Brando scene. Some of my other favourite scenes, Bryce. Another brilliant one is Captain Bligh's chart. At one point, he gets a chart out, and it's just a modern map of the world, with like Antarctica on there, everything's perfectly mapped.
Fantastic.
With a giant red dotted line from England to Tahiti. It's brilliant.
Probably so well mapped that Pitcairn's actually on there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I enjoyed the arrival in Tahiti. I was thinking, how have they spent $19 million on this in the 60s? And then I saw when they arrived in Tahiti, and it's just incredible. The colours, the extras, the boats everywhere.
Glorious
Fabulous.
Technicolor. Doing it justice here. Yeah.
Yeah, this is actually filmed in ultra wide. It's wider than most films are shot in, this film. So, it's even more kind of cinematic in that way. Any other scenes you had that you enjoyed?
No, I got, because I had that one which you talked about there, which I just found very funny. That was my favourite scene. I have got a good companion movie, if we could get on to that.
My favourite scene, I suppose it's quite boring now. I like Brando's melodramatic death at the end, where he's clearly still breathing. I can just imagine the director saying, "Marlon, please, we've got to get this. Please just hold your breath for 8 seconds." But he's clearly still breathing.
It's peak Brando, but I also think, as I said before, it completely defeats the point of the movie. And I don't understand why they portrayed him as wanting to go back to England. Why? Just why? Anyway, but yeah, it's peak Brando. It's lovely.
Yeah. But I actually think the most... It was maybe a bizarre choice, but just after the mutiny, when they send off Bligh and they chuck all the breadfruits out, which they really did, and apparently the breadfruits were taking up a huge amount of space on the real Bounty. In this movie, it looks like at one point Brando is sort of relaxing on a chaise longue, with like in the staterooms of the ship, but in real life they were completely cramped by these breadfruit. And so I like the shot of the breadfruit floating in the wake of the Bounty.
Sod the breadfruit is what I say.
My favourite shot.
I have a good companion movie for this.
Yes, companion movie.
And this is just through, I'm not sure if it was, to use 1790s lingo, the intervention of divine providence or just serendipity, but this afternoon... on the television came on a movie, an American movie from the 1950s. Have you heard of it, called The Cane Mutiny? I
have heard of it. I don't know anything about it.
I thought to myself, what on earth is this? The Cane Mutiny. It stars Humphrey Bogart as a ship's captain of it's quite a similar story actually. It's World War II, and we're on a US ship, a minesweeper, and the captain is Humphrey Bogart, and he, like Bligh, he's very sort of hectoring, but he's quite paranoid. It's a really strange movie actually, but it kind of goes into the real sort of legal dynamics of Mutiny. It's a very odd movie, but I just thought of it as a companion movie because you'll remember in Mutiny on the Bounty that the first sort of cruelty of Bligh portrayed is that someone's eaten the cheese, haven't they? Something to do with cheese. Yeah. And he has someone flogged for eating cheese, or...
I think he nicked the cheese and he blames it on someone else, doesn't he?
Yeah. Insubordination to do with cheese. And similarly, on the food theme, in The Cane Mutiny, which is an odd movie, Humphrey Bogart, as the captain, who's very unpredictable and paranoid, decides that he wants to go down for a midnight feast. And he finds someone's eaten all his strawberries. So at like 3 a.m. in the morning, he assembles the entire ship's crew and all the officers, and he says to the officers, I want a full investigation, I want a search to be carried out for the strawberries, and I want a full report on my desk by 8 a.m. in the morning. It's just hilarious. Then, bizarrely, the second half of the movie is like a courtroom drama over whether they were right or not to mutiny, which, again, like with Captain Bligh, clearly they were. Turfing people out of bed at 3 a.m. in the morning to look for strawberries, giving the breadfruit better condition than the men. I mean, come on. But it's an interesting fellow mutiny movie, which just came by happenstance. I came across this afternoon. Quite enjoyed it.
The stars aligned.
Yeah, so that's The Cane Mutiny. I'm sure there's other mutinous nautical movies, but I can't think of one off the top of my head.
I can't think of a mutinous one, but you've mentioned the 1935 and 1984
Yeah.
Mutiny on the Bounties. I'm quite excited to watch both of them if I get round to it. I quite like the sound of them. Apparently the 84 one is a lot nicer to Bly than the other two. There is, of course, Master and Commander, if you enjoy, as I do, naval romps of the period. We should get round to watching that at some time, Bryce, on the pod.
Yeah, but it's an adaptation, sure, isn't it, Master and Commander?
Oh, it is.
It's breaking our
it's...
golden rule. We just do stuff like this, which is, if it had been an adaptation, this probably would have been a much better movie. But because it's so bonkers as an original piece, it just descends into absolute chaos and hugely grossly inflated budget and lots of hijinks, as we've described. And at the end of it, a very disjointed movie, actually, in some ways.
Yeah. Talking of which, I actually forgot to mention that at the beginning. I wasn't sure. I was trying to find a quote to read out for the intro for this movie. And I've got two others for you, which I enjoyed from this movie. First one is, "You're ugly enough to send a funeral up an alley."
Wow.
Which I think is a great line. And there's an old guy who looks like a stereotypical pirate in the opening scene. And when Brando wafts up the gangway, and the women come with him, some women come with him, he says, "Nothing compares to a woman washed all over and smelling like a Frenchman."
Okay, right, yeah, nice sort of good nautical homosexual theme there.
Yeah, a bit of homoerotic overtones there. Brilliant. So which historical figure from the movie should do the DVD commentary? I think it should be Fletcher Christian, because I think Bly has had his historical say when he was acquitted at his hearing after he came back from England. So I think we should hear from Christian.
Yeah, and it's also like the historical pedantry of the sort of most boring and predictable kind, when people say he wasn't that bad, Captain Bligh. Well, actually, I'm on the side of the mutineers, and so I would agree. Or one of the other mutineers, who's the lad that survived? Adams,
John Adams. Yeah.
Give them their story. I love in the spirit of liberty and equality and fraternity, which quickly turned into an incestuous and murderous nightmare. But I can't fault their spirit and their bravery, actually. And I mean, they did cast him off with quite a lot of supplies and navigational equipment, didn't they? They didn't just throw him in the deep, or Bligh. I mean,
I think it is true that is it true that Christian, I think, did give him his sextant?
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Marks out of 10, Bryce.
Well, I love Marlon Brando in this. I love the fact that it wrecked his career for 10 years. I love the bloated budget. But again, like I say, the message is just so confused. And you've given us a couple of examples of the script there. I think the script is actually really poor as well in places. So although I should say, it's definitely worth a watch. Like you said, a bit of beer and a pizza, and this is great crack, really.
Yeah,
but
I didn't realise it was 3 hours long, mind. Jesus.
Yes,
but I did. I did have a good time watching it.
But I would give it, for those reasons, and despite the fact that I love Brando and I love glorious disasters of movies like this, actually. But I'm only going to give it a 4 out of 10.
Oh wow, I've given it a 7 because
right.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed watching it, but maybe not for the reasons why it was originally made 60 odd years ago. But I gave it a 7. Yeah. Hall of Fame. What item would you have for the Hall of Fame? I think I would have Bly's chart, where it's just, or anything from Marlon Brando's wardrobe.
I think for me it's got to be the breadfruit. Stick the breadfruit in there.
Ah, that's a good one. Yeah, we'll put one of those in. What would happen in a sequel if there was one?
Well, I think didn't they try and do sequels about Bligh, or then this again? I think at some stage the script was turning into a sequel of what happens to the men when they're on the island. So it might be that it might actually go all the way up to 2004 when they're all done for rape and incest.
Jesus. Well, at the end of this movie, I was surprised that there wasn't a voiceover, because there's a couple of voiceovers throughout the film, and I thought we would end on one saying, "Oh, the descendants still live on the island." Perhaps the history's too dark, basically, because it does. One of the guys does say at the end, "We'll tell our story somehow. It only needs one of us to survive." And I thought maybe that was a knowing nod to the fact that only one of them did survive, basically, to tell their story.
I missed that, but then I do hate knowing nods in historical movies, as you know. I miss that. But yeah, I got the impression, and that's why I gave this such a low mark, is that the end of the movie seemed really rushed to me. Actually, I really got the impression that they couldn't. Well, I think they were given 100 days to finish it, weren't they?
Were they? Right, yeah.
Yeah, or thereabouts, or I seem to remember that they couldn't. What I'm trying to get at here is that they couldn't wait to finish this. I think, and I think it shows really.
Did you get anything for Sood's Corner?
I didn't, I'm afraid. I had the quote from the New Yorker, the idea that Brando is playing a maritime Hamlet, which I thought was very good. But it's not Sood. I think it's actually really quite an accurate portrayal. No, so I don't have anything for this.
And nothing for military historians, pedant's corner. I've got nothing.
Well, I think there's so much. I mean, again, to get back to the rivet counters, I'm sure there's bits and pieces here which are I'm sure naval historians will be. Our postbag will be full if we miss this one out. But I actually didn't have anything down there because I just got so seduced by the tales of Brando on set, to be honest with you, that I sort of forgot that aspect.
I think he was very. He wanted the character to be like that, didn't he? I think this movie went through 3 directors or something. Against the wish of the director, he wanted to play Christian as a sort of upper class fop. Yeah,
and he clearly had quite a lot of input on set. I mean, he sounds like a holy nightmare to be working with, to be honest. But like you say, there are 3 different directors and different scripts, and I think it shows. I think it's actually a really disjointed movie, and actually probably the one thing holding it together is Brando. But in some ways, it's a confusing message he's giving off in the way he's playing Christian. Although it's probably quite accurate and faithful, like as we described before.
Well, I didn't come up with a five-a-side football team name, but the population of the Pitcairn Islands, 35, is sizably less than the Chelsea squad this season at 43. So maybe we'll leave it on that thought. Thanks, Bryce, for that, and we'll see you next time on the Historical Movies Podcast. That's it for this episode of the Historical Movies Podcast. Don't forget to leave us a review on your chosen podcast platform. Spotify and Apple Podcasts make a huge difference to the algorithm. And if you're on YouTube, don't forget to leave a comment or a like or subscribe. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.